In this video, we're going to look at a feature of Tableau called stories. And the official definition of a story is a sequence of visualizations that work together to convey information. Essentially, it's something like a PowerPoint presentation, a series of one or more sheets and or dashboards, as we learn to do, strung together with the idea of creating an ongoing narrative that tells a particular story or illustrates a particular point. The functionality is actually relatively simple. We've already learned how to do fairly complex calculations and visualizations in our sheets, and how to connect them in dashboards so that they are potentially interactive. The stories feature, if you look at the very bottom of the screen, you'll see New Worksheet, New Dashboard, and a third button that says New Story. The Stories feature is built onto all this existing functionality with the goal of stringing it together. And to create a new story, obviously, clicking this button brings us to this menu in which we have tabs for Story and Layout, and a big section that says Drag Sheet here, which should tell you where we're going with this. The actual size of the presentation can vary. If you choose from the Size menu at the bottom here, it's a pull-down list. You can change width and height manually. And if you select the down triangle, you'll see a list of predefined resolutions. And I'm going to up this one up to 1654 by 1169. Which makes for a much larger footprint on the screen. There are also options for configuring to phone and different types of browsers and whatnot. I'm just going to go with a large scale one here. And what I have already prepared is a data source from our IMDb database, in which I'm joining the title table with the directors table and the corresponding name, along with the genre and ratings, so that I'll see a section of movies, their directors, and the genres and ratings of those corresponding movies. And I have added a filter. Rather than dealing with millions of rows, I've got a filter that I'm using to limit to only those films that were directed by people named Alfred Hitchcock. There might be more than one person named Alfred Hitchcock. In fact, we can see by clicking on Name Basics and doing Update, I can see 3 name IDs associated with that name, only one of which has birth and death years populated. But on the off chance that these were created erroneously, I'm just going to cast a wide net and include all the films that were directed by anyone with that name. And the relationship line that connects them, if we look more closely at this, I can see that I'm using the name constant to connect them, and I'm using just sort of open sum records match, which corresponds to an outer join. But in actual practice, it will limit my records to a much, much smaller subset of films. And as you can see, I've already created some sheets for this data set, one of which is listing the number of shows per year. These would be movies, although some could be television shows. From the year 1922 all the way through 1985. There's an entry for 2014. I'm pretty certain he was dead at that point, but we work with the data we have. I've got one visualization for this. I have another one predefined, which simply lists all of the films and their genres and ratings done by this director, and they're sorted first by start year, and within that sorted by rating, in rating rank descending. That is to say, the most popular film for the year by this director, and on down, so that these can be scrolled through chronologically with an eye toward which one was most popular. I'm not going to walk you through the process of creating this because we already know how to do this. I'm just showing you, having done these and added one more in which the number of films per year at the top here corresponds to the average ranking of films for that year by this director. And what we see here, I mean, if you're looking for a pattern in the data, is that generally speaking, Hitchcock stuff was fairly popular. There did not seem to be any sort of correlation between the number of films per year, which has spikes here and here and here, and the actual ratings of them. If we're looking for a pattern, the takeaway from this is that they seem to have been relatively popular and slightly increasing over the years, with a few outlying, values that didn't do quite as well, all of which have ratings of more than 6. Well, pretty much all of them anyway. And one more visualization in which I've done a tree map of these films broken down by year, and within each year a breakdown listing the genre, the total number of films in a particular genre. What we find is that the highest cluster, the highest combination, is the year 1955, which, if we go back to the number of shows per year, 1955 was in fact the most prolific year for this director, in which he did 6 films. And looking at that movie list, if we scroll down to 1955, you can see the 6, with their fairly high rankings, all the way. Lowest one had a 7.5 for that year. And for each one, the list of genres, because it's a one-to-many relationship. Each film can belong to 0 or more genres, and these seem to have overlapped. But what we do find, looking at each of these 6, is that all 6 of them, while they might have also comedy or romance, they all belong to the mystery genre, which is what's visible here in the tree map. 6 of the films for that year were mysteries. Of the 6, 4 of them were mysteries and also crime. Another 4 were drama, and so on and so on. A useful visualization. Individually, each of these charts and graphs tells us some piece of information, some useful bit. What we're going to do is put together a story which patches them all together into a kind of narrative. In this case, it's not a clear-cut narrative that makes an overwhelming point, but the process of doing this, I'm going to show you, can be used when you find a smoking gun in the data to make that even more accessible, make it even more obvious by building up to it with a series of other visualizations. So in order to make a new story, as I said, simply click the button that says plus story. I'm going to rename this story. Right-click rename. Let's just call it Hitchcock Story. And what you can do is populate panes, P-A-N-E, panes of a story with individual sheets and or dashboards. If you look over here on the left, you will see the names of the visualizations I've done on the left, and as I mouse over them, a little preview of each one, in case I've forgotten what it is. So, my first sheet in this story, I'm going to give a caption. The button up here says add a caption. By clicking on this, it allows me to type a brief caption of what this pane is going to do. This is going to be my introductory pane, in which I give a year breakdown of the number of shows by this director. Dragging that over, you see it populates this window, and it's still interactive. I can click on these individual bars, and it will give me the information on them. In the same way as dashboards, this story is linked to the sheet itself, so that if I do make a modification to this, let's say I wanted to change this into a packed bubble type visualization instead, going back to the story, you'll see it's changed there as well. I'm going to do an undo on that, Control Z, because I don't want to use bubbles. I'd like to use the bar graph, which shows fairly clear spikes in the years of in which he produced multiple films. And most of these years, there was only one. But there's a pretty clear pattern in the late 1920s, before, of course, the big stock market crash and the Depression, after which we see fewer films, but it's still a steady stream, right? Coming to a head, well, in 1944, toward the end of World War II, he seemed to be putting out quite a few films, and then during the 40s and 50s, that seems to have been leveled off down to one film a year, which is nothing to sneeze at. Putting out even one movie per year is a lot of work, but you do see a significant ramping up from 1954 and peaking in 1955 of very large number of films or shows per year over the course of nearly a decade. Sort of golden age, right? Now, to describe this to our viewers, we have just this caption. There's not enough room in the caption to actually put useful information, but what you can do, and what you should do, is add some text to this pane. And as this little message tells us, drag to add text. If I were to drag this over into my visualization, it creates a box, and when I let go of that, it comes up with the description window. I've got some text I already have pre-formatted. I'm going to type in this basically a description of what we're looking at. Alfred Hitchcock was a prolific director for over 50 years. He made films, often 2 or more per year. I can change the format of the text here, the alignment, etc., etc. I'm just going to go with the defaults right now, and clicking OK, that puts it all into the little yellow box here, which, as you can see from the icon at the top here, is dockable and movable. Notice it doesn't quite fit. I can't see the full text, but of course I can click and drag to resize this to the point where it actually fits all the text in. Deselecting it, I now have this movable, dockable, basically caption. So now I have an introductory pane in my story that viewers can see that shows them over the years the number of films per year that Alfred Hitchcock directed. If I want to add a new pane, there are 2 buttons up here at the top under Story, one for blank and one for duplicate. If I were to click duplicate at this point, it would give me a second pane that's identical to the first. I'm going to do an undo on that, because I don't want a duplicate of this. I want to have a brand new blank pane, which comes up, and you'll notice in the caption section here, I can go back to the first caption, and that selects that first pane. And over here, where it says Add Caption, I'm going to do another one. This one I'm going to title Full Movie List. And these captions are mostly internal for our reference, but they're also visible to the users. So within this, where it says Drag Sheet here, I'm going to drag a sheet over to my full movie list, releasing it. Once again, it shows me that same sheet that I developed earlier, which of course is linked to that sheet. Again, I'm going to drag some text over in here. This time around, the text is going to describe basically the breakdown. His movies span various genres, typically several different genres per film. That's the point I'm going to make here, is that in order for them to be able to interpret that final visualization with the tree map, they need to understand that one film can be contained within several different genres. And a description, essentially in the early years of the 1920s, these included some interesting genres that we don't normally expect from Alfred Hitchcock, like romance and sport. He did do some comedies, but most of us are more familiar with his later work, which of course is, the mysteries and the thrillers, murder movies, right? But in the early years, in the 1920s, he was getting his start and doing some interesting different stuff. As always, I can resize this, move it around, and leave it right where it is. I think I may have actually created a pane that's a little bit too large for this. Change from landscape. Let's reduce that down to 1100 by 850. When I do that, you'll notice things get squeezed in a little bit. Let me go back to my previous intro, make sure this still fits. I think this is about the sweet spot for getting this information in without wasting too much space. And even sport. Now I'll add one more pane, another blank story point. Defaults right up to the section where it's asking for a caption. going to call this one Ratings Over the Years. And as before, I'm going to drag over one of my predefined visualizations. I'm going to add a text box, and in this one, basically a description of what we saw before when we were trying to find a pattern in the data. We didn't really see any correlation between the number of films per year versus the actual average rating. So we'll put something into that effect, that his films drew consistently good ratings. So if nothing else, that tells us this. And I'm going to move this up so that it's not in the way. And these text boxes, the text in the yellow, can be placed anywhere. If we're not careful, we can overlap useful information. So I think you'll notice there are also default settings for transparency. I'm going to put this back up here where it's mostly out of the way. And we'll do one more blank story point in which we'll place our tree map. I'm going to call the name of this story point Golden Age 1955, in which his most prolific year, in which he did the largest number of films. And you can see the way I've set up this tree map, that year, and that breakdown of genres for that year, shows up in the upper left because that's the largest number. Once again, I'm going to add a text box, and within that, a little description of what we're looking at. 1955 was his most prolific year, encompassing 6 films, overlapping in various genres. They nevertheless all centered on his most popular mysteries. Now, these little text boxes here are more for human consumption than that of technical or administrative people. They just like the name says, this is a story. This is a description of something that people can use to interpret these graphs. And it tells them the story of something that happened. Either a narrative of things over time, which is particularly suitable to the stories format, or more of a sort of discovery of how things have been determined by analyzing and drilling down and finding certain things. What we wind up with is a series of story points bound together, left to right. And what you can do to visualize this whole thing, press the F7 key, and it takes the whole thing full screen in the same way that we do with PowerPoint and other presentation software, slide decks they call them now. It makes full screen visualization, and I can use the cursor keys left and right to move through these story points and illustrate my story. This is similar to PowerPoint, but unlike that PowerPoint and those types of software, this is still interactive. I can still click on these genres. I can still mouse over these points and see information. And these can be configured with all the features we've seen from sheets and from dashboards. This particular visualization, this story, doesn't have that much interactivity, but it could. I think you can see how we could, if we wanted to, create a dashboard linking together multiple visualizations in which you could click on one particular value, and it would give you the option for drilling down values in another sheet. All sorts of possibilities here, but the actual mechanics of stories are relatively simple. Like I say, the button for New Story is down next to the button for New Dashboard. The interface for changing layout and text fields, very straightforward. And the result is a kind of narrative that's designed for human consumption, or displaying to individual or groups as a presentation. These presentations can be given on an individual basis, or they can also, just like sheets and dashboards, they can be published to Tableau online to make them visible to a wider public.